A trending lease provision for landlords that is extremely helpful is the requirement of tenants having not only renter's insurance for their property, but insurance for any possible liability they have to a landlord. My name is Sasha Struthers. I am an attorney in Los Angeles that does landlord-tenant law, and I'm doing this video today because I find that there's a lot of landlords who don't have this as a requirement in their lease, and a lot of tenants that don't have this that totally wish that they did have it. To begin, renter's insurance actually is a benefit for both landlord and tenant. Most instances in which there's some sort of damage to the property, like a flood, a fire, etc., that's usually on the tenant, that anything that is damaged is their responsibility. Many leases have provisions that say that the landlord specifically is not insuring that and is not responsible for that damage. If you're a landlord and your lease doesn't say that, you should have a lease that does say that. I have a lease template that's going to include a lot of things I talk about in this video. You can click in the link below and purchase that. Tenant insurance, there's, like I said, two prongs. There's tenant insurance for the event that stuff is damaged, or like the tenant's items are damaged. And then there's insurance for the tenant if they do something to the premises. Let's say that the tenant damages the unit from their own negligence, and maybe they move out and maybe they don't, but they damage the unit. It is very prudent that the landlord make the tenant have insurance, because in that event, the tenant's likely not going to have the money to fix whatever it is that they broke or damaged. If the damage is really high, they're likely to move out and try to avoid that. And if you're a landlord, you've ever had to deal with this, as much as lawsuits seem to be the answer, they're sometimes can be very hard. It's hard to track tenants. The tenants don't always have money. There's collection issues. So having the insurance policy, it's there, it makes it a lot easier for the landlord to have recourse. And again, when it shifts liability to the insurance in the event that something happens to the premises and the tenant stuff is damaged, then it's on the insurance to compensate for that. So a lot of leases now require the tenants to have insurance to protect their stuff and for any liability to the landlord, and that is usually a very common policy provision of a lease and a requirement. Insurance isn't too expensive. It's usually about $10 to $20 a month for the tenant to pay for. If you have property management software like Appfolio, I know that they partner with an insurance company so the tenants can pay for it through their portfolio and they pay for their rent. Another thing is insurance helps both parties have peace of mind. Knowing that there's insurance there tends to, as much as it seems like it's an expense for the tenant, it's good to have it, because I've seen tenants where something has gone wrong, like there's been a flood in a unit. The tenant luckily had insurance and it paid for the damage that was sustained to their property. If they didn't have that, they would have been really out of luck. And the tenants, they can choose, what kind of policy limits they want, and they have the ability to get more coverage if they have stuff that's worth more money. And they can, obviously, I'm not an insurance broker, I should talk to an insurance broker, but does give peace of mind to the tenant that their stuff would be protected, and to the landlord that, like, the person who's in the unit, if something happens, they'll be covered. It also tends to make the tenant more accountable. If they are willing to pay for the insurance in the outset and they're willing to accept that as part of the lease, it tends to indicate that they are responsible, just like from the get-go. If they fight about it or they don't want to pay for it, then it tends to be an indication that maybe they're not willing to comply with lease terms, or that maybe they're not the best fit for the apartment because maybe they're just not responsible. The policy is pretty easy to transfer, so in the event that tenants maybe move, the policy can then be transferred to their new unit and cover a new landlord. Another important tip that landlords should take into consideration is when they are leasing and they have renter insurance as a requirement, that they, one, get a copy of the declarations and proof of the insurance, and two, that they have themselves named as an additional insured under the policy. I've had it, being named as additional insured and having a certificate of insurance is good, but it's definitely much better to have a copy of the endorsement that specifically states that the landlord is an additional insured under the policy, and then to have copies of the policy declarations for their records. And you again can make that a requirement. And tenants tend to like, if you have a lease that says that they have insurance and they don't have the insurance, that could be grounds to terminate the lease. I have been surprised by the number of landlords who don't have this. I've been surprised by a handful of landlords who actually don't have like property insurance in general. Making this a requirement in your lease definitely helps you as the landlord and is something that you really want to enforce, especially if you have it. Like, let's say you have it in the lease, you want to make sure, because it's on you, the landlord, to get copies and proof of the insurance. It doesn't help you that it's in the lease if you don't enforce the lease and put it in place and make sure and follow through. And if the tenant, let's say it's in your lease and the tenant's lived there for a year and maybe it's on a month to month, you want to make sure that you get proof every year of the renewal of that policy, because again, the policy is only good for the period of which it covers. So if, let's say it was a first year lease, the tenant had insurance, maybe they're month to month, just because it's in the lease, just because it's month to month, doesn't necessarily mean that the policy was renewed. So make sure it's on you to make sure that the tenant renews the policy and gives you proof of their renewal. That is my 2 cents about renter insurance. It's highly recommended. If you are a landlord, you definitely can reach out to your insurance agent and discuss with them the different avenues or ways that tenants can get this. Tenants tend to be able to kind of, research it on their own. You as a landlord could research it and give tenants, a list of insurance companies that provide renters insurance, and that will make it much easier for the tenant to comply with it if you give them, some sort of resources. But I definitely think if you are a prudent landlord, you make tenants get tenant insurance and then you follow through. And it gives peace of mind to both. It's really, in the grand scheme of things, not that expensive for a tenant to have tenant insurance. And it just, can make the whole landlording process more peaceful and more enjoyable and make you feel slightly better. I don't know where I was going with that. I feel like I've said my piece about this, but definitely you should look into it. If you like this video, I have plenty of other videos with info and resources for landlords and just, things to take into consideration. Also, if you like this, you might want to subscribe to my newsletter. Every week I send a newsletter out with very helpful information, news for landlords. So if that tickles your fancy, you should check that out. You should also like and subscribe so that you always are aware of when these videos are posted. Thank you.